Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval, Mischief, and Mayhem. I'm your host for this episode, and this episode focuses on the wonderful world of medieval beer. I would like to welcome our guest, Noelle Phillips. Dr. Phillips received her PhD in English from the University of British Columbia in 2011 and subsequently completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto Centre for Medieval Studies. Langland, Chaucer, Lydgate, book history, and medievalism have been her research areas, but she's gradually included beer history and beer medievalism among her specialties. Through an odd little conference paper she gave at Kalamazoo, she eventually wrote her first book, Craft Beer, Culture and Modern Medievalism, which came out with Humanities and Amsterdam University Press in 2019. She then co-edited and contributed to the essay collection Beer and Brewing in Medieval Culture and Contemporary Medievalism with John Geck and Rosemary O'Neill, which came out with Palgrave in 2022. Her most recent book is not academic, Brewmasters and Brewery Creek, which was published in fall 2024, is a public-facing history of craft beer in Vancouver, British Columbia, beginning with the 19th century pioneer breweries and ending with the city's recent craft beer revolution. In between these books, Noelle writes for local craft beer publications and teaches full-time at Douglas College in Metro Vancouver. She's a certified Cicerone, like a beer sommelier, and she judges beer competitions, which is amazing. So welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem, Noelle.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
It's wonderful to have you. Now, of course, medieval beer culture. This is one of the things that people think of. Modern popular culture does an awful lot to make us think about medieval beer. I think back to Dances with Trees, which is actually my nickname for Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, with Friar Tuck telling them, we are going to talk about beer and the importance of beer. So, please tell us about the importance of beer in the Middle Ages.
Before I do that, I'd actually like to mention that our focus on the Middle Ages as this sort of origin point for beer, or this sort of foundational story of beer, is itself ignoring a much longer history from the Middle East and North Africa, in which people were brewing for thousands of years before we did in the Middle Ages. So I think there's a lot of sort of focus on Western culture when it comes to beer, when actually its origins are much older. Having said that, it has a lot of power, right, in how we think about beer, the Middle Ages. I actually have a beer here that uses the Robin Hood, it's sort of hard to focus, but it's called Maid Marionberry Ale, and it's actually done for a pantomime by a local brewery, but we have Robin Hood and Maid Marian together in one figure, and it's sort of using this idea of Robin Hood. They thought, it'd be appropriate to have a beer because it's this medieval story.
And it goes with the Friar Tuck narrative and that idyllic image of Robin Hood and Marian in the forest, which in and of itself is largely a medievalism too.
Yes.
But actually, go ahead and touch some on that history of brewing, because a lot of people are familiar with some of the craft breweries in America. Dogfish Head, they went back to ancient recipes, the Aztecs and the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. So can you talk a little bit about that non-Western, non-medieval history of beer?
So can I talk a bit about it? I'm going to say, first of all, it's not my primary area. I will say that it shows that beer has been much more accessible than a lot of other alcoholic drinks. So if we define beer as essentially a fermented grain-based beverage, usually a barley-based beverage, it's much more easy to grow, easy to kind of brew multiple batches than many other kinds of alcoholic drinks. And they sort of think, and again, sorry, there's scholars like Patrick McGovern who do much more work on this than I do, but the idea of beer sort of emerging as part of the regular diet, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, It sort of coincides with the introduction of agriculture, the ability to grow different kinds of grain to make bread. And so there's a bit of a debate over whether it was beer or bread that was really the first thing. Was it bread that was left out wet and they kind of realized what was happening?
The chicken or the egg of beer.
The chicken or the egg, yeah.
Yeah.
And as brewing sort of continues, it never really stops. Wine does become more popular, like especially across the Mediterranean. It does become more of an elite kind of drink. But much earlier on in Sumeria and Egypt, beer, the leaders of these countries would have their own brewer. So it actually was more widespread drink than wine, more easily grown and produced than wine, and was much earlier a more elite drink. Wine did sort of surpass it. But yeah, I urge people to look into the work of Patrick McGovern and everyone he cites to look into those very early centuries in beer history, because it's not my field.
Right.
My field is like looking into what happens in the Middle Ages, right? So in the Middle Ages in Europe specifically, so not in other countries, but we're looking at actually the European Middle Ages. Many people, I mean, I don't know about you, but do you think of often, you have a sort of alewife hat on, but I'm sure you sort of hear about monks. We often think of monks when we're thinking about beer, right?
Right. And that was actually, I mean, I was going to point out the alewife hat and ask you questions about this. I will point out for anyone who's interested, you can buy these from Dragon Wings LLC. They sell at the Maryland Renaissance Festival, but also online, and they will do custom alewife hats. But you're right. That goes back to this question of who is it who brews beer? What are the cultural associations of beer with medieval European societies?
So beer, I'm going to go back to accessibility. Beer was an accessible drink for so many people. Pretty much everyone was drinking beer, including children. You'd have small beer. So you could have really low alcohol beer brewed. This is often an economic, there's economic reasons for this, but you'd brew with your grain with the first batch, and then you'd reuse your spent grain, what's called spent grain when it's all wet at the end, and you'd brew another batch. But of course, there's not nearly as much sugar left in it, so the alcohol content is much lower. That would be called small beer, might be about 2%, and that would be, kids would drink that. We have records from monasteries of, monks drinking beer every day, even when they were fasting, often sort of used in place of water. The Abingdon Abbey would give monks a gallon of beer a day. And so we're not assuming that this is like a gallon of, an 8% double IPA or something.
Heavy beers, right?
It would be a gallon of like a pretty low ABV ale.
Right.
In some areas, it was true that brewing would have made the water safer to drink, but that actually wasn't true in all places. There were many cities that did have good water hygiene practices, and beer wasn't boiled in all cases either. So it's a little bit of a myth that beer was only consumed because of health reasons. It was also just consumed because it had grain included in it. It actually had nutritional value, and most of it had a fairly low alcohol content. So we have it consumed and cheaply made across all levels of society, from people like essentially peasants up to, King Henry II delivered a couple huge barrels of his beer to the King of France and had Thomas Becket deliver it for him.
And he didn't poison it.
He didn't poison it, and it was sort of like, look, our beer is as good as your wine.
Okay.
So which is pretty cool. I will say also a little weird tidbit here, a bit of a tangent. The coat of arms for the Brewers Guild of London, which sees Thomas Becket as like their patron saint. And I'm trying to recall the actual date of this initial coat of arms, but it actually has an African woman or a dark-skinned woman in the coat of arms, or in the early coat of arms. And apparently this was Thomas of Becket's, I believe, stepmother. And it's kind of a hint to some of the perhaps African origins of brewing. There's various reasons why people discuss this woman is in the brewer's coat of arms, but definitely an interesting detail if we think about the longer history of brewing.
Well, and of course, if you think about that longer history of brewing, one of the things that a lot of people mistake about the Middle Ages is this assumption of universal whiteness that,
Yeah.
when you think medieval, people think white, Christian, male, predominantly patristic European society. But Europe itself borders on the Mediterranean. And for, people who don't really think about it, Egypt, where a lot of beer was brewed thousands of years before the Middle Ages, they're not white. And a lot of people don't even, it doesn't click that when you talk even about church history, North Africa, the Council of Carthage. Carthage is in North Africa. Again, not white people. And so the history of beer, tracking in its evolution through the Mediterranean and up into Europe, it's not the domain of just white Europeans or even white Scandinavians. That gets tied into a lot of the Viking affect. So in your research, do you find that a lot of what you're doing is dispelling some of those common misconceptions about beer itself, but the Middle Ages as a whole?
That's what I was trying to do in my first book to some degree. And I've cited and I acknowledged in that book, it's not a book that focuses primarily on race or gender, but it tries to sort of incorporate those. I do want to point out to people like Cord Whitaker, who does a lot of amazing research on how things like Blackness were understood in the Middle Ages. It's really hard for us to understand now, essentially post-slavery, what that was like in the Middle Ages, and that race was understood and processed differently. So, and I again, not my primary field, but I do want people to look at, again, people like Cord, amazing work.
And Geraldine Hang's race.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Geraldine Hang as well. Yeah. Yeah. And many other scholars whose names are not right in the top of my mind right now. I'll say that in my first book, Craft Beer Culture and Modern Medievalism, that was something I was thinking about a lot, about how unimagined history of beer, partially imagined, again, looking back to the origins of the Middle Ages, helped to kind of construct our sense of masculinity and whiteness in the 20th century and into the 21st century even. And that it's our concept of what the Middle Ages was, even if that's not true, and our concept of what medieval masculinity was, what medieval beer was, helps to inform how we define men now and the origins of men. My own young man just waved goodbye to me there. my son.
That's fair. That's perfectly fair. Well, I mean, this is an interesting question. So when we think about even the construct of medieval Europe and who makes beer, who drinks beer, as you say, the modern medievalism ties into this idea of what it is to be a man. For us, for modern cultures, whether it's American, Canadian, European, though a little less so in Europe. I mean, though in England and Ireland, I went to university in Ireland and for years, long ago in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, women didn't go into pubs proper. They had the snug, because the snug was that offset little room in a pub, and that's where the women went. And they had a little part of the bar, and they were expected to only drink half a pint. And to the point where I dated an Irishman for 5 years when I was in Ireland, and his granny, who was from inner city Dublin, she would go to the local pub and drink half pints of Guinness. And it was only ever halves. She might drink 12 of them, but she'd only ever drink a half. So there was this gendered assumption about what was proper for women to drink and what was not. And also, even now in modern European beer culture, a lot of it, you get a lot of women who might drink a cocktail, a gin and tonic, rather than beer. Though that's not necessarily true. And of course, that doesn't owe its origin to the Middle Ages, does it?
No, I mean, that's a very complicated thing. And certainly in the Middle Ages, women were definitely drinking beer. The reason for kind of curtailing or restraining women's alcohol consumption now, I think there's a whole story to be told about that.
Please, feel free.
But I want to actually go back to the Middle Ages, though, because that perception of women and drinking is not something that really emerged strongly, I'd say, until towards the end of the Middle Ages, when we start to look at an increasingly kind of misogynistic view of women in the alcohol industry. I'm thinking, obviously, this John Skelton's poem, The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming. uh, mocking or satirizing an alewife. And we see increasingly negative portrayals of women working in tap rooms, women serving alcohol, women making alcohol. Lydgate's ballad on an ale cellar, the woman's too flirty but doesn't mean it, and she's, being a blank tease. Yeah.
The beer
Yeah.
wench idea.
Yes, that kind of idea. And this becomes really, this is born out of misogyny. It's much more towards the end of the Middle Ages, though. So if we look to the bulk of the kind of early to high Middle Ages, this is not, alewives are not disparaged in the same way. I'm not saying it never happened, but they're certainly not stigmatized or disparaged in the same way. And in fact, they're just sort of, it's more accepted that they're part of that beer culture. And I want to acknowledge here a couple of women who've done amazing work on this. One is Judith Bennett, who has an incredible book on, and I always get the title wrong, it's like Brewing and Brewsters and Alewives in England. And brewing, it's a book about alewives and brewing in England.
I will find the title and post a link.
Yeah, please. I apologize, Judith. I use this book all the time, but for some reason the title, I always mix it up in my head. It's one of my main resources. I love this book. Judith Bennett's done so much like granular work in the records of brewing. Amazing book. The other is Dr. Christina Wade's recent book, The Devils in the Draft Lines. And this is a public-facing book about a history of women in brewing. And so I really recommend Dr. Wade's book. I recommend Dr. Bennett's book for this. But yeah, if we look back, brewsters, this is what female brewers are called. They were some of the main community brewers across towns and villages in England. We see ale conning or ale tasting, basically making sure that the ale is appropriately measured and people aren't getting cheated. We see people's beer, men and women's beer, being tested locally to make sure it meets the standard of the bread and ale size. And some of those testers were women as well. So women were often the community brewers. Sometimes they would brew under their husband's name, but often under their own name. Really common for widows to be brewers as well. It was one of the ways that they could make money. Marjorie Kemp, obviously much later, but she, tries to make money in the 15th century trying to brew. She doesn't do very well, which it's like, yeah, girl, same. Like when she talks about the yeast falling, and I'm like, oh, I'm a home brewer, right? So I'm like, right. Yeah, I know what that's like.
Yeah.
But it was monks that were brewing in the monasteries. They would brew for their community. They'd also brew for guests. They would brew at a much larger scale. So monks and monasteries ended up, as the Middle Ages proceeded, having way more capital to invest in brewing and to be able to sell it than women did. David Perry has done a great article on this, comparing medieval alewives to the tech industry and Google Bros, what he calls Google Bros, and basically showing how as an industry becomes more popular and requires more capital to be invested in it, to make more of it, to scale up, women tend to be pushed out. And this is sort of what happens towards the end of the Middle Ages, is women, alewives, brewsters, who were selling from their homes, making beer in their community, not being disparaged or stigmatized for it, they start to be able to not participate as much. Guilds start to form in the early 14th century. Those guilds become way stronger by the 15th century. And then you see women participation in the guilds. They actually are in the guilds at first, but they drop off, at least in England, they drop off. So this is a kind of systematic exclusion of women from an industry that was becoming really, really profitable.
Well, and that actually, leads to some of my questions about that, because, some of the stories that get told about women being excluded from beer making and the guilds because the men of those guilds were shoving them out. Is it true, or is it a myth, that that's where you start to get some of the accusations of witchcraft and the association of the besom, which is German for broomstick, with witches' hats?
No, it's not true.
Oh man, but that's
okay. I know. It's so women accused of witchcraft and women who are brewers were both stigmatized. They're both marginalized, right? Especially towards like the 16th centuries, 15th, 16th century. But there is not really any evidence that they were somehow overlapping each other or one sort of seen as a cause of another. I'll say, like, you see in the Tunning of Eleanor Rumming a kind of accusation that women could like make a really gross, disgusting beer with chicken poo in it that would somehow trick their husbands, or trick men, something like that.
You could put
That's
anything in a
Yeah.
cauldron to do whatever you wanted to somebody, really.
But in terms of like the tropes, the hat and the broomstick, again, Dr. Christina Wade has done a thorough debunking of this and sort of pointing out where some of these images first emerge, like in terms of witchcraft. When does the witch hat first start to become associated with witches?
As
The
opposed to
cat,
being an alewife hat
yeah.
to
When
identify
does
them at a fair selling their beer.
when does that happen? And she, anyway, I point you to, I can give you the link as well. Dr. Wade's debunking of that is very detailed, and it's quite clear that it's tempting to see this, but when you actually look at the timeline of when some of these concepts emerge, it doesn't match up with originating in misogyny against medieval alewives.
So, in other words, the accusation of witchcraft isn't necessary for the exclusion of women. They simply
Yeah,
excluded them. And that
yeah,
was part of the misogynistic process of trying to essentially take over the market.
yeah. And any reason to exclude women, right? So we see a lot of, again, accusations of sexual immorality and things like this as well. Carissa Harris does a lot of great work on this kind of thing. We had a great chat at a Canterbury Fails live podcast at Kalamazoo, where we talked about sort of medieval tapsters and how this translates to modern, what Carissa calls restaurants, women, in skimpy outfits serving men beers, these kinds of things, right?
Like Hooters.
Yeah, like Hooters, right. And Twin
sports
Peaks.
Bar idea of the scantily clad waitresses, as it were.
But women are seen as more sexually available.
Right.
And so it's part of an overall movement of misogyny to exclude women from an industry that is extremely profitable. It's not to say that, again, it's not to say that this is something that anyone is planning. It's just that it's sort of the natural output of men taking over an industry and deciding they want to be able to retain this income and not really welcoming women as part of it.
Right.
Especially because women would have, if you think about, I kind of imagine this is not a fully accurate comparison, but I find it useful sometimes to think about the early monastic system of brewing with greater capital, larger systems. They just had much more space, probably more advanced technology as a kind of, predecessor, like, sort of anticipating modern corporate brewing, so much larger macro style brewing. And then women brewing in their home, where they just put out, you think about the witch's broomstick, this is another myth, but people would put out a branch or something outside their home. Women would put one out when their beer was ready to drink, and people could come into their house and buy beer from them. That feels like craft brewing to me, right? Or at least the initial spirit of how people conceived of craft brewing initially. So we still see now these two visions of what brewing is: craft, more individual in the home, and then corporate, you're going to have a more consistent product. It's going to be scaled up. You're going to be able to make way more of it. And I kind of see alewives and monasteries as it's somewhat, it's similar categories, I guess, similar distinctions between them.
Well, and of course, monasteries have the full weight of the church behind them. Yes. So they are able to monetize and develop their system of distribution because of those church connections, but also because the monks could be dedicated to do that. I mean, that's all they had to do necessarily. I mean, contemplation and prayer. But if you're in a monastery whose main focus is brewing beer, you did that 24/7. It's kind of like some of the other distilling monasteries like Chartreuse or Benedictine. So you don't have to worry about who's feeding you because somebody else is. You don't have to necessarily, you might be part of tending the crops and bringing in the materials, but by and large, monks had the time to just devote to the beer where women might not, correct?
I'd say that's probably true. just when you have a larger community, when everyone's working together like that, women's work brewing beer was in addition to all their other domestic work involving food preparation and everything else. And one would assume that in most monastic situations, the labor is divided in a fairly regimented way. There's also, I mean, as we get into the later Middle Ages and the guilds start to emerge, there's also greater, not church control, but governmental control over brewing. And so you see, for example, I'm trying to remember which country this was in. Actually, it might have been London. I've just been doing a lot of reading for a different paper about a bunch of different areas, somewhere in Germany and somewhere in England. But basically, there was a limited amount of most taverns had to get their beer from what were called, I think they were called common breweries, but they were sort of larger breweries in the city. And that's just one example of a way to kind of regulate the industry, to control the industry, is that I mean, the Bavarians did this in the 15th century when they said only royally appointed breweries could brew with wheat beer, and then we're the only ones that are allowed to have it. And then in the 19th century, you get a different brewery, basically Schneider, buying out those rights because they had expired. But the control of government over brewing kind of starts to have more influence in the church's earlier control over brewing. And I say the church's control because of the church's association with monasteries, not because they were explicitly necessarily doing anything to regulate brewing. But what became initially that small form of control, that assize of bread and ale, where you measure like how much grain is being used, there sort of grew out of that, or in addition to that, much more extensive forms of taxation and regulation. And again, this is something that tends to disempower women because women just don't have as much access to capital, or even honestly informal ways of buying off people, old boys clubs, those kinds of things. It tends to exclude women. Part of that, and I wanted to address this as well, because I think it's an important thing to understand about beer in the Middle Ages. Part of this taxation system had to do with gruit versus hops. Gruit was the sort of spice, this is not fully accurate, it's sort of an herb and spice mix that was used to flavor beer instead of hops. So gruit was used as a kind of flavoring agent, as a preservative, before hops were used. Gruit, and there's lots of different ways gruit's defined, and there's a really specific definition in the Low Countries that's not used elsewhere. We won't quite get into that.
Yeah.
In my edited collection, there's a really good essay about this, and Martin Cornell's written about this as well. But if we look at my shirt here, I have a shirt from Driftwood Brewery in Victoria, British Columbia. They have a beer, called Naughty Hildegard. So this is an image, a 19th century image that they've redone of Hildegard von Bingen, who writes about including hops in beer as a kind of health aid and preservative. So it wasn't like, oh, I love that hoppy bite of an IPA. It was like, it was that she knew that this could help make your beer last longer and could aid in various ailments that you have.
So it was medicinal in that sense.
It's medicinal, yeah. Medicinal. And so Pliny the Elder also talks about hops, but also, again, in sort of medicinal ways, not in a beer way. Hildegard does talk about hops in beer, though, specifically. So this is 12th century, and hops were not used systematically in Europe until probably the 14th, 15th.
So the addition of hops is something that comes in as a medicinal aspect with Hildegard Bingen, but also where are hops grown?
Well, they're grown almost everywhere now, but then they were grown largely in sort of Central Europe. Okay. So the Low Countries, you have a lot of hops, and this is where they become most popular, especially in Flanders. Flanders is a major hop growing region. And so when England first starts importing hops, this isn't until, I'm trying to think, I think it's probably almost the 16th century. England's quite late to it. They get most of their hops from Flanders. So because of the import issue, people in Europe, breweries in Europe were using hops way before breweries in England were. and hops eventually kind of overtake gruit as the additive for beer. But like gruit, hops are also subject to state or county or country regulation, essentially government regulation. But it's when we talk about beer in the Middle Ages, what we're often talking about is actually what they called ale, which is unhopped beer. When they start talking about beer, in most cases, again, I'm generalizing a bit, they're referring to hopped beer. For
Interesting.
us, ale and beer, we now distinguish between ale and lager now, and everything's hopped. But back then it was ale versus beer. Lager wasn't invented yet. And ale versus beer, and then one had gruit and one had hops. And so you even see in the 16th century little dialogues and funny little plays where these are personified. You have ale talking to beer and arguing or what have you. And so when we think about ale throughout most of the Middle Ages, it's not hopped. It's going to have a very different kind of taste. Much of it would have been sour, slightly sour. It wouldn't have had be able to be preserved long. And that's also why gruit was added. It's because the beer may not have tasted that great.
It's like adding spices for piment or hippocras to mulled wine is because the wine wasn't very good. And
that's exactly,
yeah, you've got to add stuff to it because otherwise it's undrinkable. I was actually reminded there's a line in the novel Beckett the novel Murphy by Samuel Beckett, and it's a bad joke, but it's why did the barmaid scream? Because the stout porter bitter.
Nice.
Right? Yeah. My
like it. Yeah.
professor at FSU thought that was hilarious because it's in Murphy by Beckett. And it's just, it is one of those beer jokes, the stout porter bitter, but you have to know that there's stout, there's porter, there's bitter. And how are those beers different? As you say, lager is a hopped beer. Yes. No. Ale is not.
So lager is not invented until later. Lager uses a different kind of yeast that wasn't really discovered until later. Lager uses what's called a bottom fermenting yeast, and ale uses a top fermenting yeast. So that's the main difference between lager and ale. Ale is actually easier to make because it doesn't require cold conditions. Lager is stored cold. Stouts and porters are beers that could only really became popular in the 19th century after Daniel Wheeler invented what's called a drum roaster. And this basically allowed people to roast to kiln their barley without having it be smoky. That was a big thing. So when porter, not explicitly smoky anyway, so not overwhelmingly smoky, you might get a tiny bit of smoky or roasty character, but a porter was invented first, and basically when they made porter stronger, and Ireland was big in doing this, they called it a stouter kind of porter, and then that became stout. So stout is a stronger version of what porter was, but these were only able to be invented when we had this invention of the drum roaster.
Interesting, because I like dark beer. I'm a dark beer girl.
You would like this. This is named after the legendary King Gambrinus. This is a replica of a very strong, delicious dark beer. This guy makes these historical beers. You can see that he's really riffing on the medieval idea of this medieval king. Again, I think this is very much propaganda,
right?
To kind of look, the king of the land is giving us our beer. It's we love the government, we love the king. He's giving us his beer. So I have a whole bunch of thoughts about that whole legend of Gambrinus, but this is a great beer, extremely strong.
Percentage on that one? What's the percentage on that
one? This one is something like 10%, which is very strong for a beer.
Yeah, it is, but
it's 10%. It's nice. Yeah, it's 10%. But the so those beers would get a bit stronger, but then a bitter is a totally different beer. A bitter is an ale. I have one here. And this makes me think of Piers Plowman a little bit. Good, bitter, best. I think of do well, do better, do best.
Right.
But yeah, a bitter is a lighter beer, so you don't have the kind of heavily kilned barley, and it's supposed to be essentially aged or fermented in a cask and served from the cask with very low carbonation. And even nowadays, like this is how people are supposed to serve bitter, because this is how it was traditionally served. It was supposed to be low ABV, like you can have a bunch of them at the pub. And it was called a bitter though, because it had more hops when it was first invented than like an English, what they're thinking of as like a pale ale.
Okay.
So English were making pale ales to compete with German pale ales, lagers. Sorry, they're not ales, but German pale beers in the 19th century. And these pale ales were, sometimes they're called milds. There's also the dark mild, which looks more like a bitter. Don't worry about it. But when they invented the bitter, they just decided to add more hops. And in this case, we're late enough that England's growing their own hops now. So they're English hops. And so it becomes a very English, very kind of national kind of beer, English hops, English grain. And it's the beer that you're going to have at the pub all the time. So when you're at the pub, you're probably going to have the bitter or the mild. And now, like if you go to North America, it was initially very hard to market anything called a bitter.
Because no they think it's bitter. They think that's
no one knew what that was.
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
like, that sounds terrible. I'm not going to drink that.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's a traditional cask ale, though.
English well, and when you think of English pubs, you have the cask ale where they have to pull the cask, the arm. It's not like your tap that you're just pulling. It's actual pulling of those cask ales. Is that the same idea? Because those are generally, when people say, well, English beer is warm, room temperature-ish, though room temperature is colder from the cellar in an English pub, generally speaking. Same thing in Ireland. Is that what they mean? Is that the bitter is those cask ales?
Yeah, a bitter. I mean, it doesn't have to just be a bitter, but yeah, it's the cask ales. It should be served at cask temperatures like 11 to 15 degrees. And
Fahrenheit or Celsius?
I
think that was
Celsius. Yeah, Celsius. Yeah. Celsius. Sorry, I actually jump back and forth between the two all the time because in Canada I do both. Yeah, it's a bit weird. So yeah, I jump back and forth. Some temperatures for beer stuff I think of in Fahrenheit, and some I think of in Celsius.
That's
yeah,
fair.
But I mean, most beers do taste better when they're served not at fridge temperature.
Right.
So even though beer is supposed to be stored at 38 degrees or slightly lower, you're not going to Fahrenheit. You're not going to want to drink all of those beers at that temperature. Doesn't mean you have to have them warm, but having them be cellar temperature or again slightly warmer actually really improves the flavor. Like you taste so much more of the beer. And so often, what do you have there? An Irish red?
This is the Flannery's Irish style red ale, and this is a craft brewery. This is New Trail, which is relatively local. In fact, specifically, I believe it's Pennsylvania, so it's just over the border of Pennsylvania from here in Maryland. But I figured that this might be, as we talk about it, the good time to open one.
Yes. I might open my bitter, actually.
Okay. Which one? That's your best bitter. And I will say, I like dark beers. I like ales. I like bitters. I like porters. I'm a big fan of stouts. Not a huge fan of IPAs. Do not hate me for that. I kept making faces with the hops. I know. If it's too hoppy for me, it's a bit like eating grass.
You're allowed to have your own
palette,
that's for sure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and when I was a grad student living in Ireland, sorry, I want to make sure that I get the head right on this. When I was a grad student living in Ireland, you'd go give blood and they'd give you a pint of Guinness for free. It was a pint for a pint. And when you're a poor graduate student, you will take it. You will happily.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they used to recommend it for breastfeeding. I mean, I don't know if they still do, but I mean, it's
content.
It's low alcohol. In most cases. So I know a woman who worked for Guinness for many years, and she said I think it was in Nigeria, the Guinness is like 8%.
Wow. Because in Ireland,
which is crazy.
It's 4.3%. It's really not that heavy.
Yeah. This one, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say 4.3. This is even lower. This one is a 4.1% bitter. So bitters often will be even lower than something like a Guinness. Bitters will often be sort of 3.5 to 4.5%. This is by Main Street Brewing. They have a cask program there. So this is like live ale fermented in the cask, and it is made on the site of Vancouver's basically oldest brewery.
Wow.
So
Okay.
this is shout out to Main Street Brewing for their great cask program.
Wonderful. Yeah,
And
this one is
yeah,
5.5%. So again, it's not terribly heavy as the Irish the Irish
yeah,
red ale. And I will say, of course, the really lovely heavy beers, the stouts, the dark stuff. There's an awful lot of craft brewery that puts various flavors that we'll talk about in a second. But I
yeah,
do want to point out that
adjuncts.
the glass for this is Hardywood Brewery down
Ah,
in Richmond, because when I lived in Richmond, Virginia,
nice.
Hardywood was one of the first really well-known craft brewers in Richmond that took off, and Strange Ways is down there, and a lot of really
Nice.
amazing craft beer. So, cheers.
Cheers. I love
Cheers.
this beautiful color, that red
Slánta.
ale. Yes. Prost.
Yes, you can say Yachida in Welsh.
Yeah. Oh, I
Prost.
can't. You can say that. I can't say
Yachida.
it.
I knew how to say it in Russian. I have now completely forgotten how to say it in Russian. It's Dostrovie. Dostrovie.
Oh, that sounds very cool. I like
I
that.
think it's Dostrovie.
Yeah.
It's my Russian has
Yeah.
faded a little bit, but skol.
Yeah. Skull. That's always a good one.
Now, and of course, there are various traditions as people drink their pints as they toast people's health. Slánta in Irish means essentially to your health, or santé
Hmm.
in French
Yeah.
to your health. And a local tradition here, I have noticed since I've moved to the Maryland area in Baltimore, people cheers and then they tap their glass on
Hmm.
the bar before they drink it. And
Ah.
apparently that is in remembrance of everyone who's not there. It's kind of a commemorative
Oh, I
toast
like that.
to everyone. And it was completely new to
Yeah.
me here. In Ireland, you don't let your pint hit the table. You just cheers and then drink it. But you have to toast with beer or alcohol. If you toast in Ireland, if you toast with water, it's bad luck.
Yeah. Don't do that.
No. So when we
Yeah.
talk about all these wonderful different kinds of beer and the craft brewing, so many of these craft breweries in the US and in Canada, and I guess now there are some in Ireland, though fewer. There are local breweries that have been popping up in Ireland because Guinness is no longer owned by Guinnesses. It's now owned by Stella Artois. And so
Yeah.
it's been taken over. So when I was in Dublin a few weeks ago, I noticed that there were a lot more local breweries. And in some ways, they're making their own name doing variations on these different kinds of beer. What is the push, do you think? And people make fun of this for adding all the different flavors. And I mean, I like some of those. I admit it. I am good for like a coffee stout with cocoa nibs and
Yeah.
cinnamon, and I will say this now. I love pumpkin beer. I'm
Go
saying
for
this to
it.
my audience. Don't hate me. Because, it's like that pumpkin spice. Bring it. I will get every kind of pumpkin beer I possibly can come September when it's available. And I will try them all. And there's some I always keep stocked because I love pumpkin beer. So that said, what is the, I mean,
Yeah.
is any of that historically based? Because, I mean, some of them claim to have ancient recipes from the Aztecs or ancient recipes from medieval Europe. That spice combination you talked about, that is not the hot,
Gruit. Yeah.
that the
So
what is
yeah,
it?
gruit.
Yeah.
Gruit. Again, different definitions. So hope no one comes at me for like she didn't. I'm saying this is a generalized term.
Right.
There is a different definition in the Low Countries for it. But gruit was basically sourcing like, what do you have near you? What kind of plants do you have near you that are going to taste good? Like rosemary, yarrow, um,
Lavender.
lavender, bog myrtle, these kinds of things. Sometimes even in Scandinavian countries, like there's a lot of stuff made with pine and juniper and things like this. So those kinds of adjuncts, often they're herbal adjuncts rather than like marshmallow or whatever, like kind of weirder ones. But we've always done it with beer. This is not something new. I think this. So I think there's certainly a beer purist movement, That started with, I mean, people point to the Reinheitsgebot. I don't know if you've heard of the Reinheitsgebot. This is a very famous 1516 law in Bavaria that restricted beer to be only made with malt, like barley, hops, and water. They didn't know about yeast, and then it was revised to like include you can have yeast, but you can't have anything else.
How
This
boring.
is why. So, but this is why, like German breweries, there's sort of a new form of this law, but this is essentially still applicable to beer. Is it made in Germany for export? I can't recall, but there was a whole poli-sci article I read a couple years ago about this, that this law or a version of it is still active in Germany. But this is what was called the purity law. And so beer had to be pure. And this is, you can imagine, this is a pushback against, this is actually a taxation weapon against gruit, right? So you can only use hops, you can't use gruit anymore. And then, right? And so often, guess who had most access to hops? Men, because it was more expensive.
And it was more commercialized.
It was more commercialized. Guess who was still using gruit more?
Women.
Women were still using gruit more. And again, I'm generalizing a bit there, but overall, that was the pattern that was happening. So the purity law is actually so there in my book, my most recent book about Vancouver breweries, is a very famous brewery in Vancouver called Granville Island Brewing. It's now owned by Molson. But the initial sort of founding of it in 1984, Mitch Taylor, who founded it, he actually advertised in Germany for a trained brewmaster. He brought him over, he flew him over, he relocated him to Vancouver. They made this, what everyone says was these amazing German beers, like really high quality. And they actually have a certificate. I have a picture of it, of their official certification from Germany that they adhere to the purity law, to the Reinheitsgebot, that they are only, in terms of the content of the beer, they haven't added stuff. They haven't added extra sugars. They haven't added any flavorings. They haven't done anything like that. So I understand the appeal of these sort of like, I want beer to taste like beer, but we've always added stuff to beer. And if you like what you add to it, what's wrong with that? Like, I feel that this drive for purity is a kind of throwback to, or an echo of, the Reinheitsgebot. I think there's so many different options for beer. I mean, flavor from beer, like it'll change because of the water acidity. It'll change because of your malt. It'll change because of the type of yeast. Belgian beers, you taste almost no hops. It's all yeast driven. And it'll change obviously because of the hops. So you have all these different flavor options, and like, yeah, if you want to add more flavor,
go for it.
Why not? I mean, I tend to like simpler beers now, but it's like I might go into a period of time where it's like I really like pumpkin beers, nothing wrong with that.
It's a seasonal thing and it makes it taste like fall. I'm a fan of tasting like autumn. But
and you should
no, go ahead. What were you going to say? Well, there's a musical group that used to perform at the Maryland Renaissance Fair, and they still occasionally perform there and at the North Carolina Fair, called the Pirates Royale. And Brad Howard, who is the lead singer, whose character Captain Moon, they had a song that was beer that tastes like beer, and it is particularly aimed as a parody of this idea of, well, they're the Pirates Royale, it's a Renaissance festival, they want beer that tastes like beer rather than all the different flavors. But of course, as you say, that was a very ancient and medieval thing to do, is what have you got? What tastes good? It's like any recipe, let's experiment and let's see what works in the flavor combinations. Oh, we've got this, let's try that. Or, hey, this might be healthier. Here, we're going to make this kind of a medicinal brew as much as anything. Mm-hmm. Now, Belgian beer, and I'm a huge fan, and the first time I went to Belgium was 1996, and I was told there were 300 different Belgian beers. There are far more Belgian beers now. There are there are hundreds and hundreds of different Belgian beers. But some of them, of course, are categorized as triples and doubles. Mm-hmm. What is that process? What is the difference with a triple and a double? I mean, I know flavor-wise, but what's the actual process that does that?
They are random kind of names. That's what the answer is.
All right, so totally random.
The names are actually intended to sort of indicate an increasing level of strength. So triple double, triple, quadruple, which is also a Belgian dark strong. But in terms of actually measuring the malt, there's no indication that this is actually a thing. So the double, if no one knows, is a very dark Belgian beer. Like when I drink it, I think of a lot of like stewed dark plums and like allspice, and like it's a very rich kind of beer. It does tend to have an average alcohol level lower than a triple. A triple has a lot of, I'd say, brighter kind of spice to it. It doesn't really have dark fruit. I almost think of like a sort of toffee kind of notes to it, along with pepper and coriander. Triples go great with things like a roast chicken dinner, and doubles I think go great with things like certain kinds of desserts and like cheeses. And then a Belgian dark strong, to me, a Belgian dark strong is like a really strong version of a double. So a really strong double is like a Belgian dark strong. And then a Belgian golden strong is it's a stronger version of the triple. Okay. It's a little bit fruitier though. So a Belgian dark strong is going to be a bit higher in alcohol than the triple and a little bit fruitier. A lot of those flavors come from the yeast, which has what we call esters and phenols, which are fruit and spice characteristics. So they're actually not additives for the most part. What Belgian brewers will add though, and I'll say that in general, Belgian brewers do not care about style guidelines. They just make whatever the hell they want to make. So go for it. They have a special sugar called candy sugar, which has a sort of molassesy taste. And that's also something that contributes to some of that sort of fruity profile together with the yeast. So it's a special sugar that most other brewers don't make. They have a special yeast that most don't make. But those beers that you're talking about right now, the triple, the double, the quad, those are what we consider Abbey style Belgian beers. So there's really only 11 Trappist breweries in the world. About half of them are in Belgium. But any brewery can make this sort of style that those Trappist or monastic breweries are known for, which are primarily those, these double and triple kinds of styles. Have you ever tried other Belgian beers like lambics or gouzes?
Yes, and I am one of my favorite lambics is Morsubi. So it's Sublime Death, I think is how that translates. I think it translates as Sublime Death, but it is in Brussels, and I love lambics. Now I've had the unflavored, the goose, that's just no flavor, and I have to say honestly, it's disgusting to me. I am not a fan of the unflavored version of lambic, but yes. I do like the lambic beers.
So lambic, we have some people get goose and goza mixed up. So right. Goza is a German wheat beer,
and that's G-O-Z-E.
G-O-S-E.
Oh, okay, that's the G-O-S-E.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to spell this wrong, but goose is actually a form of lambic. Goose, it's either G-E-U-E-Z-E, I think is how it's spelled.
That's right.
So a goose is actually a combination of 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambics mixed together.
Okay.
Lambic by itself is just one vintage. Goose tends to actually be a bit more drinkable than a straight lambic. So some of them are very acquired tastes. I've tasted some lovely gooses, and I've also had some lambics, and I'm like, this is too sour for me.
Right.
These are soured using bacteria and also sometimes wild yeast. Sometimes they're open fermented and just wild yeast comes down, or they'll add wild yeast. If they're older, like the older they are, generally the better, like the more approachable I find them anyway. They get a little bit funkier, but sometimes they will add the like flavoring. And so you'll get like a creek or like a framboise, like a cherry or raspberry or blackberry, right? And then those all of a sudden, like it works somehow, like it works together. So our version in North America of this is often kettle sours, right? So they just add, it's not a wild fermentation. They sour the beer, they add fruit. In Belgium, it's much more like they age it in barrels with the fruit. They sour it in a much less controlled environment. So it's sort of hard to tell how it's going to end up being. It's a little bit less predictable.
And it's also they're less sour because I mean, so
Yeah.
modern American sours and North American sours, some of them are not that sour. I mean, again, it's
Hmm.
the process, it's not the
Yeah.
flavor.
Yeah.
Um,
They use
and
a different bacteria too sometimes. So they
right,
often they often don't use Pediococcus is one that most brewers will not use for like what we call a kettle sour. They'll use like a lacto, which is more lemony to us and it's less, but Pediococcus or Acetobacter are going to be much more vinegary and like hard for our palate maybe to accept.
right.
But I will say that I've judging beer. So sours are not my thing in general. Judging beer has sort of forced me to learn how to assess the beer, even if it's not a style that I like. And then I've ended up actually liking styles that maybe I didn't like before. So
I mean, I have had some New England IPAs where I was like, wow, that's lovely. That doesn't taste like grass. It's fantastic. And I think that is simply just, my palate.
yeah, yeah.
But the whole thing about beer production and the development of beer, and of course, modern assumptions about, oh, well, that's very modern or it's not very modern, does tie back, as you mentioned, the German law on purity. And of course, Belgium and all of their famous beers and everybody associates, and even England and Ireland. I want to go back to something that you said earlier about Henry II and the beer to the French king and the association of beer with a sense of national identity. Can you go ahead and expand on that a bit more? Because especially for medieval people, this whole question of national identity, and I have argued in several of my books about the fact that, yes, there is a national identity. Modern nation states, not necessarily, but most definitely a national identity that often pitted certain cultures and societies against each other. How does beer tie into that sense of nationalism?
It's a really good question. It also depends on, of course, what era you're talking about, right?
Like anything with the Middle Ages,
Yeah,
over 1,000 years and an entire complex system of societies.
yeah. So I talk about this a bit in my first book. A lot of the records about beer refer to regional styles, or especially poetry and songs about beer refer to regional styles. So this might not be, again, wouldn't be national, but it's certainly a kind of precursor to thinking about what country you belong to, in this case, what region you belong to. My region's known for this kind of beer or that kind of beer, or this kind of malt or this kind of hops later on. The kind of driving of beer into a national drink, I think we definitely start to see in the late Middle Ages with things like initially a kind of pushback against hops as a Flemish import.
Uh-huh. Because
And
there
we
was a
know
lot of
from,
contact between the Netherlands, the Low Countries,
yeah,
and and Flanders and England. I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of back and forth with Flanders and England,
yeah. I mean, and also think about like the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, the
right?
anger against Flemish merchants at that time, right?
And
Those
it
poor
wasn't just
guys.
and it wasn't even just peasants who were revolting. It was English
Yeah,
merchants as well against
yes,
the aristocracy because they burned the Savoy, which is John of Gaunt's house, and of course John of Gaunt is called that because he was born in Ghent.
mm-hmm.
So there is that again,
Yeah,
the association of the Flemish with the English royal family and the aristocracy. That's kind of like, but you're not English,
yeah. You're not part of this.
right?
Yeah,
Burn
you're
it.
not part of this. And it was
Yeah.
seen again. Initially, hops were seen as like bringing something foreign, a foreign adulteration into English beer. And so, of course, then England starts to grow their own hops, their own malt. It's really beer ingredients that I think make for or help contribute to beer's ability to stand in for nation. We don't call it really terroir in beer, but I mean, England has a very famous kind of malt that's very traditionally English and very expensive called Maris Otter. And any English beer should be made with Maris Otter, especially if it's what's called the best bitter. It means it's the best form of English grain. The English hops, the Fuggles, the Challenger, like there's a bunch of different kinds of English hops. But I also think using beer, I mean, we see it in the 20th century, kind of referring to beer. Churchill sort of did this a bit in wartime speeches, and even sort of references to sort of beer as enlivening armies, as supporting the war effort, even though usually in war efforts, beer was also kind of limited
Because
because
they needed the
everyone,
grain for other things.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I do want to go ahead and start to wrap this discussion up, which is fascinating because we could probably go on forever, especially as we're drinking beer. And I want to point out that you hosted an amazing Belgian beer tasting during the pandemic on Zoom, which allowed all of us from disparate parts of the world to participate.
That was fun.
Yeah, it was great fun. But I want to ask you, just kind of in closing, what are your next research steps? What are you working on now? But also, how do you see this research contributing to modern understandings of the Middle Ages?
To modern understandings of the Middle Ages. Well, one of my research projects, I mean, it's hard when you're working full time, teaching 8 courses a year at a college. I'm doing a session next year at New Chaucer Society with Bruce Holsinger. It's in Freiburg, Germany, and we're doing a session called Alcohol Epistemologies, different ways that the Middle Ages sort of interpreted their own surroundings through drinking culture, basically. So we have a few really interesting papers coming up for that. I think I'm going to be working on another public-facing book. I do enjoy public-facing writing. I'm going to be either doing a book about the history of brewing in Victoria, BC. This is named after the Empress Victoria, the British Empire. Or my other kind of thing that I'm starting to fiddle with is a history of women in brewing across British Columbia. Since the early breweries until now, I think I found some really interesting stories. This would be more work because you're going to all the British Columbia, if no one knows, is a very big province. It's huge. And I think there's a lot of cool stories to tell about women in brewing. So I am thinking about public facing writing, and any opportunity I have to do more medieval beer writing, I'm into that too. And in fact, I'm probably going to be contributing to David Coley and Matt Hussey's collected essay collection for the Canterbury Fails. It's an academic book.
Yeah.
It's from one of the academic publishers, and I'm going to be working on an essay with Carissa Harris about Lydgate's Ballad on an Ale Cellar.
Nice. Very, very
So,
nice.
yeah.
And I mean, this whole question of beer and craft beer culture and just beer culture full stop, modern society has in some ways both elevated but also stigmatized the drinking culture, period. And of course, when we look at the back, we look back to the Middle Ages and people want to say, oh my gosh, back then they were all drinking beer and they were drunk. It was rowdy. It kind of lends this sense of debauchery and lends to this misidentification of the Middle Ages as somehow looser morals or less progressive or something like that. Do you think, of course, that modern temperance movements, modern concerns health-wise about beer and alcohol, it lends to this mischaracterization of the Middle Ages in any way?
Okay. So one, I do think that it is important that we remain aware of the health concerns of alcohol consumption, that we don't encourage overconsumption. I feel like this is obvious. There are,
Obvious, yes.
and it's like whether it's simply just like I don't want to gain a bunch of weight, or if it's I have the liver issues, whatever it is. I think that's important. I think a lot of these sort of perceptions of alcohol as, everyone's drunk and rowdy in the Middle Ages is partly a hangover from the initial temperance movements of the early 20th century and from Prohibition. And I will say that Prohibition was very much rooted in white supremacy. And we do see in some of the global temperance organizations, there are still links to related organizations that come from that history.
And Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism, which of course intersects a lot with white supremacist kind of movements. I'm not saying that I'm not saying global temperance movements are intentionally white supremacist. I am saying that some of these instincts to ban alcohol or moralize it in this way have these troubling roots. And so I think it's so important to have a balanced approach to alcohol, to be aware of the health concerns, but also to be aware of a kind of a really stringent moralization of alcohol is not, that doesn't mean you're necessarily in the moral right here.
Right.
And they are linked to, honestly, often Christian nationalism, which saw alcohol as a sin. We still see that in some movements, Christian movements. I think it's that could be a whole other discussion. But be healthy with alcohol. Lots of breweries are making good non-alcoholic beers or low alcohol beers. A bitter, a 3 to 4% beer. I think those are good compromises.
Well, and Guinness, 4.3%
Guinness,
alcohol.
Guinness.
And even in Dublin, they have popularized Guinness Zero that has no alcohol in it. So, recognizing that for those people who do not want to drink alcohol but want to have the flavor and the social aspect, there are many other options. This is not in any way to valorize drinking as, that culture. However, but it's also important, I think that's the importance of this discussion, to say when we try to claim a historical precedent for something, or when we try to separate ourselves from that historical past, it's important to really understand what the reality is.
Yes. And there are many healthy ways to incorporate moderate drinking. And I think actually in many cases, many kinds of European societies do this. Many non-white societies can do this too. So I think it's important. I think that we should always welcome people to drink whatever they want, never pressure them to drink, obviously. But also, if you want to support a local craft brewery, this is another reason I really love craft beer. I love supporting a local brewery that uses local ingredients. Go in and buy one of their non-alcoholic beers, or their non-alcoholic ciders or what have you. I love supporting local. It's a hard business to be in. And so this is why, anytime I have a choice of drinking a beer, it's usually going to be one I've bought from a little craft brewer. So
brilliant. Well, Noelle, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this podcast episode. And I hope that you all will join us for the next episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.